We are in Hebrews chapter 9. If you guys want to make your way over there, we're going to be starting this morning in verse 16. We've been looking at how Jesus, there's this common theme in Hebrews about how Jesus is better, and the authors just hits all of these things on how Jesus is better than uh, the law, and he's better than angels, and he's a man, and all of these interesting, well, these really cool aspects of who Jesus is. And now we're in this really long stretch of how Jesus is the better high priest, and we're making our way through. We're getting towards the end here, so some of the really cool exciting things are happening, but there's still a lot of repeating of what's going on. And I'll just remind ourselves that part of the reason that this is a long stretch is because the Jews were really did not this concept did not come easy to them, that Jesus could be a priest. He spent a lot of time explaining how it was even possible for Jesus to be a priest because he's not from Levi. He's not Aaronic. Sorry, I had to say that. He's not from the Levitical line, so he doesn't fit in there, but he is the priest in the order of Melchizedek, which is what the author points out. And then he's just banging in how Jesus is better as a high priest than the previous. Now we're kind of switching it a little bit because there's a lot of mixture here of not only how Jesus is better than the high priest, but how there's this new covenant that we have with Jesus, and how that new covenant is also better than the old covenant. So there's kind of this mixture of two things going on. And that makes sense because the priesthood was part of that old covenant, and it's different now in this new. So it's just really cool how he's gonna just bring all of this home. That's where we are at. Let's read. We're gonna actually, it's quite possible we'll get through a lot of text today because there has been some repeating, but also, if you guys want to slow down, we can slow down too. So there's that possibility. Uh, let's see. Tim, what version are you reading in this morning?
NIV.
NIV. Is somebody reading in something else other than New King James or King James or ESV? What are you reading in, Jason?
The CSB, Christian Standard Bible.
Yeah, okay. What can you read for us? Verses 16 through 22. I'm just curious of hearing a
Sure.
new translation of this. So
16 through 22.
that's correct.
All right. Where a will exists, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will is valid only when people die, since it is never in effect while the one who made it is living. That is why even the first covenant was inaugurated with blood. For when every command had been proclaimed by Moses to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and goats, along with water, scarlet wool, and hyssop, and sprinkled the scroll itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God has ordained for you." In the same way, he sprinkled the tabernacle and all the articles of worship with blood. According to the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness.
Interesting. That was really interesting. Okay, I like that.
Mhm.
I'm just bringing up how it's interesting because in verses 16, the CSB, that's what you were reading from, right? They call it will, but it's interesting because then it's the same word later on, they call it covenant, which is actually different than what mine says. Mine has it translated as testament, which is interesting as the first word, and then later on it also translated as covenant later on. So it's really interesting how they handle that. So that's kind of part of what we were going to discuss at the first part. Is in verse 16 it says, "For where there is a testament, there must also be the necessity of necessity be the death of the testator." And so there's this concept here that we don't want to miss, even though they're using some language that might not be familiar with us, because we're talking about a contract, really, right? This is what we're talking about. And when Jason read his, it was a will, which is the contract of that's supposed to be executed when someone dies. But covenant, there's death involved in the covenant, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And there's other, and mine says testament, which is interesting. So I just want to point out, if we kind of try to distill this down to the lowest denominator, we're talking about a contract. That's what we're talking about. And there's different forms of contracts. And these contracts that they're doing might be slightly different than what we're used to, because they were in a different form of government back then in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament. So the wording is just a little funny, but I like it. This is cool. So he talks about in verse 16, when there is a covenant or a testament or a will or a contract, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. And so here is the point that they're making here. When you look in the Old Testament, when they had these types of covenants, contracts, the way they would do it is in fact, when they call it a covenant, that means cutting, right? That's this whole idea that what they would do to do this is they would take some animals, often more than one, and they would cut them up into pieces. And we see this picture of Abraham when he makes a covenant with God, which is a very interesting passage. They cut. There's some cutting that happens. The animals are cut up and they're lined up, and then the idea is the people of the covenant are gonna walk through the cut up animals. And this death of these animals, this is a picture. This is a pointing of what's gonna happen if either one of the sides breaks the covenant. If either one of the sides breaks the covenant, then you are allowed to kill that person, right? This whole picture is, it's the death of animals, and if one person breaks it, then the payment for that is the death of that person. So that's what's going on here. And so that's when he's saying, when you cut this covenant, there's going to be some dead things going on. Okay, it is started by the death of the animal. But it's important to understand there's two deaths that happen during the cutting of this covenant. And he's going to talk a little bit more about this in verse 17 and 18, and we'll talk about it too. But I just want to point out, there's two deaths that happen in the cutting of the covenant. There is the death of the animals, which is a picture of what's going to happen if somebody breaks the covenant. And then two, if somebody breaks the covenant, there's the death of that person. So there's these two deaths that happen in this type of covenant, assuming somebody breaks their end of the deal. And so I just want to point it out, because this is important, that there's going to be the shedding of blood twice that's going to happen. Once is a picture, and then the other is the consequences of breaking that covenant. And so the first verse, when he says there must be the death of the testator and the death in this will, it's important to understand this is not, when we're talking about our covenant with God, or the covenant God has made with mankind, this first death is not the covering of sins. This is just a picture of what's going to happen when the covenant is broken. And I'm stressing this because this is really cool. We're going to see that all of this is pointing to two different deaths. There's the sacrifices, which is this picture of what's going to happen. And then there's Jesus dying, which is the consequences of the broken contract. And so there's this cool picture that he's setting up here. Anybody have a comment before we jump into verse 17 and 18? I'm getting excited, and so I feel like I got to slow down a bit, or I'm going to jump way ahead. All right.
In the NASB, it says, not the testor, it says the one who made it, which, like you were talking about with Abraham and God is actually the one who walked through it alone, not with Abraham. So there's going to be the one that dies, the one that made it, which points to Jesus, which is, I always like things that point to Jesus in the Bible.
I love it. I'm so excited that I've got that written in my notes like 3 pages down, and I'm trying not to jump ahead because you're right. This is fantastic. There's this great picture of Jesus that happens in that Abraham, that covenant with Abraham, which is really cool. It's really cool that when God, see, now you got me going. I got to jump ahead now. So it's really cool that when God makes that covenant with Abraham, he does two things. One is he makes it so Abraham falls into a sleep so he can't actually walk through the cutting, so that the consequences that of him breaking that covenant are not actually on him. And then the second is that God walks through the covenant. And he's pointing out that, first of all, Abraham is not capable of keeping the promise, the covenant that he's making. But second of all, God is going to pay the consequences for when Abraham fails. And this is all a picture. Again, there's just this great thing. There's the first cutting, which is the picture of the consequences. And then there's the second death or the second shedding of blood, which is the actual payment for the consequences. And if we're jumping way ahead, we see that Jesus is the one who walks through that, who is the one who sheds his blood, and it is the actual payment of the consequences for breaking this contract. So this is all really cool. And I just want to thank you, Sean, for giving me permission to jump all the way to the end here. So I appreciate that. All right. For verse 17. For a testament is enforced after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the testator lives. And again, this is pointing out that there are there's two sheddings of blood. And what he's pointing out is the power of the covenant is that the person who fails to keep the covenant is going to die. And when that person dies, that's when the whole covenant, the whole contract is all fulfilled. Until that time, there's just a promise. It's just, the whole thing is just a promise. If I don't keep up my end of the deal, you can do this to me. And that's the promise. And that's supposed to be the motivation for keeping the covenant. But at the same time, there's no power there because the person can break the covenant. And when they do, then the power comes in where they actually execute the covenant. And I use the word execute, and I guess that's a proper word, but when they complete it and they fulfill that with the shedding of that second blood. So there's this point that the author is making, that there's two sheddings of blood. There's the one that happens at the start, and then there's one that happens at the end. And so we don't want to miss that, because that's the whole point of this section here as we get into it, is that I'm getting ahead again, but it is that the sacrifices that they were making in the Old Testament, those were all pictures. And those were all pictures of what was going to happen. And then Jesus, when he dies, that's the actual consequence. That's the payment. And that's when the covenant is fulfilled. And so when we say Jesus didn't come to take away the covenant, but he came to fulfill that old covenant, here's it right here, right? He came, he shed his blood, and then it is fulfilled. The consequences of that covenant is all paid for and all done. Really cool stuff. Okay. I gotta look at my notes here. Okay, so let's read verse 18. I'm gonna read it. It says, "Therefore not even the first covenant was dedicated without blood. For when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats with water, scarlet wool, and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, 'This is the blood of the covenant which God has commanded you.'" So the thing that the author of Hebrews is talking about happens in Exodus chapter 24. I think it's just worth reading. So let's jump to Exodus chapter 24. It will be quick. This is right after they have come out of the land of Egypt. So it's Exodus 24. We're going to read verses 3 through 8. Tim, would you mind reading verses 3 through 8?
When Moses went out and told the people all the Lord's words and laws, they responded with one voice. "Everything the Lord has said, we will do." Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. He got up early the next morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offerings to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in the bowls, and the other half he splashed against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. They responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey." Did you say 8?
Yes, please.
Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words."
Okay, so we have this really interesting picture that the author of Hebrews is bringing up. He's talking about this covenant. He brings up this covenant made that the children of Israel made with God when they come out of Egypt. So exactly how he describes it, right? They kill an animal, they sprinkle with blood, they do all of this stuff. And then right immediately after this, Moses goes up to the mountains to get those 10 commandments. That's when he's going to go up there and God's going to take some stone and write those 10 commandments. What's interesting is immediately after that, the children of Israel break the covenant, right? That's how good they are at keeping this promise. Is they sprinkle the blood, they make this covenant. Again, it's a cutting. So there's the shedding of blood that has to be done. And it's a picture of, hey, when we break this covenant, you can do this to us. And then they immediately break it. And if you read the story, it's really interesting because God gets a little upset, right? He's at one point, he's like, I'm just going to destroy them all, Moses, and then we'll just start with you. And by all account here, they just made a cutting covenant with God that they would keep his will or keep his commandments. And if they don't, they're saying God has the right to kill them. And God's like, okay, I've got this right. I'm going to execute it. And Moses pleads, hey, no, please don't do that. And God relents and says, okay, I won't do that. But it's just really interesting how this is how we all are. We can blame Israel and say they're crazy. You know, how can they go after a false god just a few days after this, just after they went out of Egypt, all of this. But we have to recognize we all have this sin nature in our lives. We're all descendants of Adam and this rebellion against God. We can do the same thing. Maybe we don't do it exactly in this manner, but if we had made this promise that we're going to follow God and then we rebel against him, that's the same thing. We made this covenant and we broke it. And so we just all have to recognize that we are all in the same place of Israel. We can't keep this promise. We can't keep this covenant. We are just not capable of doing it because of this sin nature we have. It's not an excuse. It's just a reality. Because we can't keep it, the consequence is somebody has to die. All right, let's go back to Hebrews.
Well,
Yeah,
hold
somebody
on.
was going to say something.
It says he sprinkled the blood on the book. What was the book?
That's a good question. I'm not sure.
Because
Well, okay, actually, from what we just read, God told them and he wrote those commandments down. So that must be the book.
no,
But then he's going up to get the commandments.
No,
Are
the
those the
commandments
same?
are already done. So I just want to clarify, the commandments are already done because that was done and we're in 24 and that was done in like 20. They get the 10 commandments. So he's already got the commandments. And so that's what I think the book is he's sprinkling it on
Okay.
the tablets. So just
Okay.
clarification.
It's a little
There
hard.
was
I had
actually a
little
book
hard.
written before the stone tablet. He was writing things down before the stone, but so I don't have the reference though. But I would just be cautious. My
Yes,
recollection was
the timing of this
yeah,
all is a little bit
yeah,
tricky just because
yeah.
what he writes does not go in chronological order here, because he
Mhm.
writes this and then he spends some time with God and then there's this other event, and so it's the timing of all of it is not, it's a little tricky. So I'm not willing to say this is exactly what happened, but
Well,
yeah, it's just
Is verse
Yeah.
7 one you guys are talking about? Your translation says a book.
And there's a, I was gonna
Mine
say, mine
says-
doesn't say book anywhere in it.
Mine says the covenant scroll. So it was a
Okay.
special covenant scroll, but yet to answer or to affirm what you're saying, John, in verse 12, God tells Moses, "Come here so that I may give you the stone tablets with the long commandments." He may have written them down, but he wasn't actually given to him to take to Israel yet. So you're kind of right. He may have already written them down, perhaps, but yet it wasn't
Yeah,
actually given to him yet. So it is kind of confusing it's kind of like Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, right? Just
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Exactly. The timing's not, it's not quite chronological the way it's written, but it's good stuff. Yeah. Okay. Where are we at? Back to Hebrews. Let's jump back there. So so this is this whole picture that he's pointing out, and he's just mentioning that this is how they did it even with Moses. There was a shedding of blood before that first commandment happened, and then there, in order for this covenant to be completed, if somebody breaks it, somebody has to pay the price. That's what's going to happen, and there has to be this shedding of blood that happens. And what we see is immediately with Moses, they immediately break that covenant. Somebody has to die because of that, or the covenant is just pointless. There's no power in that old covenant, Old Testament at all, unless somebody pays the consequences of breaking that. All right, so this is where we're at in Hebrews. Now we're going to jump to verse 23. And we didn't read this, so let's see. Charlie, would you mind reading verses 23 and 24?
hey John,
23 and 24.
Oh, yeah, hold on. Yeah. Yes,
can I say
Jason.
something real quick?
Absolutely.
And it kind of goes back to one of your original questions or comments, the difference between will and testament versus covenant, right? And so I think the
Okay.
reason why your translation and even mine say the same thing, right? What's it called in real life? Last will and testament, which
Yeah,
basically
yeah.
is the same thing, right? And I see that different than a covenant, different
Okay.
than that most, right? Because what it is, it's a promise. It's a promise that someone who writes that will, these are the things that will be done to you or be given to you, but it'll only go into effect once I
When
pass,
someone dies.
right? So that's what I think happened with Abraham. There was some promises given by God, and it wasn't a covenant like the same kind of covenant that God had with Moses and the Israelites. And so Jesus' death fulfilled the both, fulfilled the last will and testament, the promises
Yeah.
of God to Abraham, because there was no and then of course the sacrifice needed because of the breaking of the covenant, breaking of the law, breaking of God's law, and needing to
Yeah.
have forgiveness of sins, and that's why he died. So he kind of fulfilled two different things: the last will and testament that God gave with Abraham, and then of course the breaking of the law of Moses. Did I get ahead on your notes too again, or no? Okay.
No.
You were
This is so
smiling
good.
as if
This
I
is
was getting
actually
ahead
a
of you.
good. This is a good transition from last week, because last week we talked about this eternal inheritance,
Right.
and now we're talking about this. And I'm smiling because isn't that just like God to do multiple things at one time? Like he's like, okay, I'm gonna fulfill this covenant and this at the same time. There you go.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. I'm totally on board with what you're saying. It's just interesting that the example that he gives is the example of Moses,
Right.
which is not. I don't think that that's the last will and testament. But I think you're right. I think you're on the right track here, and maybe that's that transition from the previous passage that we read to this one.
Just a thought.
it's
You guys were
great.
talking about Abraham earlier.
Yeah.
So, and you spoke of it as
That's right. That's right.
covenant, the same type of covenant with Moses, and I didn't see that. So,
Yeah, no, you were right. I'm just using it because you're right. And there's this great, the covenant that happens with Abraham is just such a great, clear picture of some of the things that we benefit from, that it's exciting, and it's hard not to interject him, but he is not actually in this particular passage.
yeah.
So yes, you were right. All right, verse 23 and 24. Charlie, I think I asked, right?
Yeah,
Can you read verse
yeah.
23 and 24?
Sure. Therefore, it was necessary that the copies of the things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us.
Hallelujah.
This is just cool, right? This is where the author of Hebrews is trying to go. He's trying to point out again that Jesus as a high priest is just so much better than the high priest that they had. And there's this confusion that the Jews at this time might have had, which was this idea that the sacrifices that they were making for their sin actually brought atonement for their sin. It actually brought remission and forgiveness for their sin, that it was the payment of the breaking of that covenant. But what we're seeing here is that's not the case. Those were all copies. Those are all pictures. This is all part of the first aspect of the covenant, of the cutting of the covenant, which is a picture to show us what the consequences really are going to be. That somebody else is going to have to die. Somebody's going to have to die for our sin. And maybe it's us, and maybe it's somebody else, but it's the pointing really of that picture. And so when he's saying that these are all make sense, all on an earthly sense. You know, they're doing the sacrifice, they're sprinkling it on the ark and on the temple and all of that on earth, but it's just a picture. They're just copies of what's happening on earth. It's not the real main event, which is happening in heaven, which is that whole thing pointing out here that Jesus is the one who pays that last final payment to fulfill the covenant. He's the last death that has to happen that says, okay, now everything is really paid for. Now there is really payment for sin. And I'm getting ahead of myself again, but that's what he's going on here. He's just saying this is the deal here. The earthly sacrifices that are happening, they're just a picture of what really needs to happen, which is this death of this one. And so we're going to get into that even a little bit more as we get into here. We're going to find out that Jesus only has to do this sacrifice once. It's not a continual thing that has to happen. And it's just a point to point out that these old sacrifices, they really weren't sufficient to pay for sin. And they have this idea, and we talked about it last week, which is cool, that in this old covenant, you sacrificed an animal to pay for the sins that you committed. And it was to cover what you had done. There was no covering of sins that you would commit in the future. But when we talk about Jesus, what he did was a payment for all of our sins in the past, as well as all of our sins in the future, because it's just done. He just paid for all of the sins. And so it's just really cool how there's this difference between them. I have to take a break. I gotta take a breath here and drink some tea. So do you guys have any thought? I feel like I'm running at 100 miles an hour right now, so I gotta slow down a bit.
Hey, I'll throw a question out there, and I fully admit this may be me being just way too pedantic about something. So going back to the top of where we read, in verse 16, it says, "For where there is a testament, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator." Great, pointing to what Christ did on the cross. God is the one who made the testament / covenant with the people, and the death of the testator makes sense. Now, this is where the pedantic part comes in, and guys set me right on this. I understand where that makes sense in the New Testament, because that is the place where Christ died on the cross. Why do we call the Old Testament when the testator, there is no death of the testator? God did not die during that part.
Well, I think that's the point. right? That's the point, is that it hasn't been fulfilled. That what they're doing is when they're doing the sacrifices, when they're doing this and they're going for remission, it's not real in the sense that it's not complete, because nobody actually died. The animal
Right.
died, but no person actually died, and there's something missing that needs to happen, and that is this future pointing to Jesus. And I think that's part of, I know somebody else wants to say something else, but I think this is a whole point of that Hebrews is trying to make with Jesus being a high priest, and this is a concept that the Jews weren't getting. Is is the author saying, no, you guys are missing it. That's not the payment for sin. The payment really happens when Jesus dies on the cross. He is the one who fulfills that covenant, because before that, it was just animals that died. No one actually really paid for the sin.
Right.
Somebody else want to jump in?
I like the contrast that it says the sanctuary was man-made. And there's a man-made copy of the covenant. So these are all substitutes. The animals were a substitute. The sanctuary was man-made. It's not in the copy of the covenant. All of things to come, where Jesus is in the presence of God. And he was the true sacrifice, but just the contrast of man-made things in the Old Testament are a substitute for what's to come in the New Testament. The true sacrifice made for the complete payment for all sins, present, past, and future.
Jim, can you restate your question, especially the part about Jesus being in the New Testament? Because I think that's something I heard.
Right.
Why-
And again, maybe this is just me being like really pedantic, but you know, it to me, it's called a testament,
Yeah,
you know, because there is the death of the testator.
right. So I think what happens sometimes is, so I believe the Bible should have been divided. The Old Testament should have included Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because when Jesus established the new covenant, it was with his blood, meaning the cross. The cross is the divider of New and Old Testament, and not the birth of Jesus, right? So I think what he did is he still lived under Old Testament law. Jesus did, because he fulfilled it. And so, and then he was the culmination of the Old Testament. He was the fulfillment, and it says those that are in Christ are finished with the law. And so I think sometimes our Bible divisions and stuff confuse us. His birth should not be in the New Testament. His birth is in the old covenant, under the old law, and it was at his death, and especially then, of course, the Pentecost, the beginning and the birth of the church, that really was inaugurated. And so he really is living under Old Testament times, living underneath the law, and then it was his death that basically encapsulated the whole thing. So I don't know if I understood your question correctly, but that's what I heard. There might be just a confusion of where he lies within our Bibles that's causing some. Did I misunderstand your question, or did that answer it?
No, Jason, I think that's a really good point, and I'm finding myself getting tripped up on sort of the modern ways that we've, you know, layered things on here.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, Jesus came along when, you know, in a time before there was Jesus, you know.
So if Moses was raised up, he inaugurated this covenant. Jesus was called a prophet like Moses when he is raised up, and he closed that covenant.
Yep.
Because he fulfilled it. And then the new begins with his blood, which happened at the cross and not necessarily at his birth and ministry. He was just foretelling, right? So, and that might help gain understanding why a little bit more to that question of yours.
Yeah,
And actually, no, go ahead, Jim.
I was going to say, yeah, Jason, I think that kind of covers up sort of the fogginess that I was having on it, and you know why I was sort of tripping over that. I
Sure.
appreciate that. Thanks.
Welcome.
The other thing is that every year they had to sacrifice from then on, after this covenant was made, until someone human died. And that was God, who is the testator, the one who made it.
Yeah, the testator, right?
Well,
Yeah.
testator has a different meaning to me. I'm thinking of testing a potato, but a testator. But yeah.
So that's when you make the first potato to see if it'll work.
Right.
It's
That
a testator.
when he died, that was the human portion of God when he died, that really closed the old covenant and made the new. I like what Jason said is really Acts should be the first book of the New Testament.
And it's a good point for his audience right here, which are these Jews in this new time, this new church period, right? And he's actually writing to them because they're like, well, I don't know if this Jesus thing's working out. I'm gonna go back to the law. And that's when he's like, no, don't do that. Don't go back to the Mosaic law. Don't go back to the law. Go to Jesus because he's so much better. And this is one of those, this is part of that argument, which is Jesus, he fulfilled all of that aspect that before it was just pointing to. It's just pictures of what was happening, and then Jesus fulfilled it all. Yeah, it's really, yeah, good stuff. I keep saying this. It's just good. I don't know how to, I run out of superlatives. All right. Anybody have any other thoughts before we jump into this next section here?
Can we make some more distinctions between? Because I know you like it.
Absolutely.
Right. So
Yeah.
we I think you guys already read it. I don't remember where it is in Hebrews, but or is it in Galatians? Moses went up to Mount Sinai and made a covenant with God. Mount Sinai representing Hagar and bondage. Jesus was raised up on Mount Olives, right, which represents life in Israel, and made a covenant with God. And so all these things, there's you're going to get to it here in a second, where no, in verse 1 of chapter 10, so I'm getting into the law was only a shadow, and just there's so many little intricate details that correlate to what Jesus, more so than just the cross. There's so many little intricate details, which tells me and gives me an affirmation of just the validity of God's word. It's not vague and it's not generalized like Nostradamus. It's so super detailed, almost minutely, that it could only be from God.
Excellent. Excellent. There is that mention of the shadow of, but we did read somewhere earlier, I think maybe in the previous chapter, about how this was all of these were a shadow. So it all fits. It's all in the right context. But it's an excellent point. All right, quick time check and we're ready to go. Verse 25, it says, not that he should offer himself often as the high priest enters the most holy place every year with blood of another. He then would have had to have suffered often since the foundation of the world. But now, once at the end of the ages, he has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this the judgment, so Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time, apart from sin, for salvation. So again, the author in verse 25 and 26, he's just pointing out that there's the big difference here between the sacrifice of Jesus and the sacrifice of the bulls. That was not sufficient. You had to keep doing it. You had to do it every year. There had to be a sacrifice for the whole nation of Israel. And it was just a continual thing. They were stuck in sin, right? There was no way out of it, and they had to atone for it, excuse me, every year. But now that Jesus has done it, his sacrifice was sufficient. And again, there's the pointing of those previous sacrifices were pictures of the covenant, of the consequences of breaking the covenant. But Jesus is actually, he's the one who paid those consequences. So the whole covenant is fulfilled. It is complete. And it doesn't have to happen a whole bunch of times. Jesus doesn't have to be crucified more than once. It's done. He just did it once. And now, and I love how he says it, He has appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. This is how powerful Jesus is. This is how powerful his blood is, that he put away sin. And so there, it's paid for. It's all done. And so I love how he does this, and he just brings it right back into something that I think is really important for us. And so he says, and as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this, the judgment. And so he's just bringing up, hey, we're all gonna die, and we're all appointed to die. We're all going to do that, and it's gonna happen. And then after this, we have the judgment. And so what's gonna happen is we're gonna die, and we're gonna have to face God, and there's gonna be this, okay, there's gonna be this accusation on us. Okay, you rebelled against God, you sinned, you broke your promises, this promise that man has. How do you account for that? And this is the great thing. For those of us who follow after Jesus, Jesus paid for it. He's the one who's going to stand there in the middle and say, all taken care of. I paid for it. I died so that they don't have to. So they only have to die once. And I love this, but there's this other aspect here, which is Jesus. And that is, he also died once. And then he's also present at the judgment. But it's a very different thing, because when he's present at the judgment, he didn't actually commit any sin. He didn't actually rebel against God. And so he's our mediator. He's the one who's standing in between us and the judgment. And he's saying, hey, I've already paid for that. He's the one who's on our side, taking care of us and preventing us from having to go on to a second death, which is what is called, I think, in Revelations, where those who have rebelled against God and there is no payment for their sin, they have to permanently be separated from God. And that's the second death, that they're going to be separated from him. But for us, we just die once. There's just this one death that's going to happen, and there's going to be this judgment. And I love the fact that he brings in that Jesus is also going to be in there. And I love how he's talking about, in this context, he's talking about us, but he's also talking about Jesus. There's this death that's going to happen. He died. He did it once, and he's never going to have to die again. And the cool thing about Jesus is he's alive now. And then verse 28, this is the most exciting part here. To those who so Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. To those who eagerly wait for him, he will appear a second time, apart from sin, for salvation. So again, Jesus also died once, but at the judgment, he's going to appear not for judgment, but for salvation. And this is this cool aspect that we have here of Jesus' sacrifice is so much better. Those bulls, they're not going to appear at the judgment, right? They're not going to be there. They're dead. They're gone. It's Jesus who's going to be there and pay for those sins. He's the one who did the payment. So it's just
I think he's going
really
to be
cool.
a multitasker at that moment. Because he will
I
be
don't
there
understand
in
how it
judgment.
works, right?
He
Yeah.
will be there in judgment, because it has been said. Yeah, I always wonder what are the, this whole thing it's all comes down to faith, right? The case that's being made in Hebrews, right? You have to trust in Jesus, right? And believe that this is what happened. And so, it's basically trusting in that, or trusting in this old system. And if you look at the old system's based kind of on man doing, and man can't do. But if you're in the world today, everybody's based on either you have faith in Jesus or you're in this man doing system, right? Everything, every religion, it's all works and it's all incomplete, what we know. And it's amazing, Hebrews, it's just great how they paints this picture. And I don't understand a lot of it because, it's this the Jewish Hebrew model, right? That we read about all the time, but obviously, but it's really interesting how, and what do the Jews believe today? The Israel, the Jewish people, right? I mean, it's traditions, right? It's right? Everything that they believe and follow, there's no temple, and they just plug along with this whole traditions, and that's what they believe in, and it's right. There's nothing there that links them to salvation, so they must not believe in God's ultimate, the plan, right? Even the plan, if you just look at the Old Testament, they're not believing in it, right? Because they're just believing in the traditions and the things. Anyways, it's very
It doesn't,
interesting.
it's not consistent. It doesn't work whatever they believe because of the fact that they can't even do Day of Atonement and all of this stuff.
Yeah.
It doesn't
Nothing.
work. But I want to piggyback off one of the things that you said, which is really cool. It is this trust in God. And I just want to point out, if you look at David, if you read almost every single one of the Psalms that David wrote, he mentions in some way or another, but I put my trust in God. And I love that. Even for David back then, that's how salvation happened. It was putting their trust in God. And it was even greater back then because he's putting his trust in God. He knows there's going to be a Messiah. He knows there's going to be salvation. He has no idea. I mean, he has a little bit of an idea of what it'll look like, but he doesn't know that he doesn't know his name is Yeshua. He doesn't know all of this stuff, but he's still like, I'm going to put my trust in that. I'm going to put my trust in God and that he's going to bring salvation. And he does it. God does it. He saves them. It's incredible. So we have 5 minutes left. Do we want to talk about this? Eagerly wait for him. I love this aspect of it. It is to those. Notice that he says it is Christ. Let me back up. Verse 28. So Christ was offered once to bear the sins of many. Notice it doesn't say the sins of everyone. And then he puts a qualifier here. To those who eagerly wait for him, who he will appear a second time apart from salvation, apart from sin, but for salvation. So there's this aspect that we have to recognize that although Jesus did pay for the consequences of sin, although he did sacrifice himself, not everyone gets to see the benefits of it. Particularly those who are not eager to see the Lord return, they're not going to see the consequences. And there's a reason for that, because if they're not eager to see the Lord return, what that says is they're not eager for the judgment of God to come, because there's going to be judgment. It's going to be tough. It's going to be rough, right? But for those of us who follow him and put our trust in Jesus, we are eager for his return. When the judgment comes, that's when everybody's going to be really eager for something, right? When the judgment is happening and you're standing there and you're ready to be for that judgment to happen, there are those of us who are going to be like, I am eager. Lord, come quickly, save me. I put my trust in you, my life. I put my whole life, my trust in you. Now it's your job to take care of it. I'm eager for that. And then there's going to be others who are going to be like, I'm not eager for this judgment to happen. I'm eager for there to be some type of pause or some type of break here, because I see what's happening, what's coming up. I love it. And this excites me. I am eager for the return of Christ. Definitely during the judgment, but I'm eager for him to come any way, anyhow, anytime he wants to come. Do it. If he wants to come here in our Bible study and speak to us, absolutely, Lord, come do it. What do you guys think?
So the point you're making, John, is that in 28, when he says, offered once to bear the sins of many, saying that the many there are the ones who have received the gift and have put their faith in Christ, right? Even though, as I understand it, Christ's sacrifice was for all, but not everyone will confess.
That's right.
Okay.
Everybody, the bar is low. Everybody can receive salvation, but not everybody will.
Can I
Yeah,
read
I
a
just
few
wanted
verses?
to I just wanted to clarify that, because I thought for a minute you might have been getting into predestination, and I was going to throw a yellow card saying, dude, you can't talk about predestination with 5 minutes left.
Hey,
You're
John,
right.
can I read a few verses based on the point you made?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do it.
So Romans 5:18 says, so then as through one trespass, there is condemnation for everyone. So also through one righteous act, there is justification leading to life for everyone. And then verse 19, for just as through one man's disobedience, the many, so he changes from everyone to many, were made sinners. So also through one man's obedience, the many will be made the many will be made righteous. Now, and then because I think Paul wrote Hebrews, if you go to Romans 1 Corinthians 15:22, he says, for just as in Adam all die, that's the disobedience, so also in Christ, that's the obedience, all will be made alive. So the difference between everyone and many is the many referring to those still in Adam and still in disobedience versus the many, or those that were in Christ because of Christ's obedience, were made alive. And so all men are condemned through being in Adam. Then it says that through the obedience of Christ, it leads to life. It didn't say it's applied, but there's that choice that has to be made. And so I think that's the difference between the going back and forth between all and everyone and many and few. So
Yep.
to make your point, John. So
I like it. All right. Anybody else want to? We got 2 minutes. Anybody else want to bring something up? Only 2 minutes worth. I know that's tough. Should we talk about predestination now? No, I'm just kidding.
No, I do love the point about eagerly waiting. I think that's an understated or often overlooked characteristic of a believer, that how much are we looking forward to what is coming relative to what is here, and putting the hopes of what is the current future or the immediate future versus the eternal future. Because I've had conversations with believers prior that say, well, no, that doesn't matter, just let Jesus come. As if when you eagerly wait for something, there's not only anticipation, but there's an excitement, there's a desire to learn more about it, there's an anticipation. I mean, we know all the different analogies, whether it's the bride waiting for the groom and things like that. There's a preparation, and everything points towards that day. You're looking towards that day. It's sort of the marker, but that can be missing. And when that's missing, I think it's John who writes in 1 John. It says, he who has this hope purifies himself. And he was talking about, of course, the Lord returning. And it's often an underlooked or overlooked, however you want to put it, characteristic that should be talked about more, probably even within churches, how that would purify us. That's all.
Yeah. So we are out of time, and so I'm just gonna throw a grenade out there, and then we'll end it. And I love what you're saying, Rich, and I'm just bringing up, I think that this is the difference between, if you're into eschatology, this is the difference between pre-trib and mid-trib or pre-wrath, or however you want to do it. For me, myself, I can't be mid-trib, because if I'm mid-trib, I'm not looking for the return of Christ. I'm looking for something else. I got to be pre-trib because I'm eager for the return of Christ. Now, I know there's other things that we can discuss, and there's differences there. But in me, that's the deciding factor for me personally, which is I'm ready for him to come now. Come now, Lord, let's do it. And that for me puts me right there firmly in the pre-trib camp. So again, a grenade, because there's a lot of discussion that could happen on that whole topic. But let's pray, and we'll continue this conversation next week. Let's see. Eric, would you